The air in the new Henderson implement dealership hung thick and clean, a sterile mix of fresh paint, vulcanized rubber, and the faint, almost sweet smell of uncured enamel on brand-new sheet metal. It was a far cry from the honest aroma of diesel, grease, and turned earth that clung to Arthur Jenkins' overalls like a second skin. He stood just inside the glass door, a ghost from another era, his mud-caked work boots leaving faint, dusty outlines on the gleaming linoleum floor. For a moment, he just took it all in. A palace of green and yellow. A brand-new John Deere 4630, its tires taller than he was, sat under the fluorescent lights like a pagan idol. Next to it, a 700 combine with a price tag that could have bought his father's entire farm, twice over. Art felt a familiar ache in his lower back as he shifted his weight. He'd been up since 4, wrestling with the hydraulic pump on his old 4020. It wasn't a bad leak, but it was persistent, a slow, steady drip of lifeblood onto the floor of his shop. He'd finally traced it to a worn-out O-ring on the main pressure line, a 50-cent part that was holding up $1,000 worth of fieldwork. He moved toward the parts counter at the back, his steps quiet and deliberate. Behind the counter, a young man with slicked-back hair and a green tie that matched the tractor's was laughing with a customer. That customer was Dale Peterson. Dale was 10 years Art's junior, but he farmed 4 times the ground. He was leaning against the counter, chest puffed out, a brand-new Henderson implement hat perched on his head. "I tell you, Henderson," Dale boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous showroom. "That new 1466 is a beast. Pulled the 24-foot disc through that wet spot behind the old Miller place like it wasn't even there. Didn't even grunt." Bill Henderson, the owner's son and the dealership's top salesman, beamed. "That's what International Harvester Engineering gets you, Dale. Power and performance. You made the right choice trading in that old 1066. "No doubt about it," Dale said, slapping the counter. He caught sight of Art then, standing there patiently, his worn flannel shirt faded to a pale ghost of its original plaid. Dale's smile tightened into a smirk. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Art, you lose your way? Thought you only bought your parts from the scrapyard." Henderson's eyes flickered over to Art, taking in the grease-stained overalls and the worn-out cap in his hand. The salesman's professional smile vanished, replaced by a look of mild annoyance, like he'd just found a mouse in his pristine showroom. He turned his back completely on Art, focusing all his attention on Dale. "So, Dale, we got the paperwork all drawn up for that Steiger you were looking at. The bank already gave the pre-approval. With the price of corn looking like it is, you'll have that beauty paid off in 3-4 years. Easy." Art stood his ground. He wasn't in a hurry. The sun was shining, but the ground was still too wet to work. The pump could wait another hour. He listened as they talked numbers that made his head spin. Loans, interest rates, depreciation schedules. It was a language he didn't speak. His father had taught him a different tongue. Cash, thrift, and the sacred rule of never owing any man a single dime for a piece of ground or a machine that was supposed to earn you a living. His 4220, bought with 10 years of savings. His 320 acres, the mortgage burned in a coffee can on the day his father passed it to him. That was his language. Finally, Dale signed the last paper with a flourish, shook Henderson's hand, and turned to leave. He clapped Art on the shoulder as he passed, a gesture that was more of a shove than a friendly greeting. "Don't work too hard with that old museum piece, Art. Might break a hip." Art didn't react. He just watched Dale walk out the door and climb into a shiny new Ford pickup that still had the dealer plates on it. Only then did Henderson deign to acknowledge him. "Yeah? What do you need?" he asked, his tone flat, his eyes already drifting toward the clock on the wall. "Need an O-ring," Art said, his voice quiet but clear. "For a 68 4020. Hydraulic pump, main pressure line." He pulled the old cracked piece of rubber from his pocket and laid it on the pristine counter. It looked like a dead worm in a surgery room. Henderson picked it up between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. He sighed, a long, put-upon sound. "I'll have to go look in the old catalogues. We don't get much call for parts on machines that old." He disappeared into the back room, and Art could hear him rummaging around, muttering to himself. Art waited. He looked at the posters on the wall, advertising New Generation Power and The Future of Farming. The future, it seemed, was all about size and debt. It was about leveraging yourself to the hilt, betting the farm on next year's prices and this year's rainfall. He looked down at his own hands. The knuckles were swollen, the palms thick with calluses that no soap could soften. These hands knew a different truth. They knew the feel of a worn wrench handle, the heft of a drawbar pin, the specific vibration of a diesel engine running just right. They knew how to fix things, how to make them last. Henderson returned, tossing a small plastic bag onto the counter. 75 cents. Art pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, extracted a single, folded dollar bill, and laid it on the counter. Henderson snatched it up, rang up the sale on the new electronic cash register, and slapped a quarter down. "There you go," he said, already turning away, dismissing Art as completely as if he'd never been there. Art picked up the quarter and the small bag. He held the new O-ring in his palm. It was perfect, supple, and black, a small circle of potential. He tucked it safely into his shirt pocket, put his cap back on his head, and walked out the door, back into the sunlight and the real world of dirt and steel. He didn't look back at the palace of gleaming paint and easy credit. He had work to do. He had a machine to bring back to life. Now, before we get too deep into this, I have to ask you all something, and I want you to be honest. Have you ever been in a place like that, a store or a dealership, and been completely ignored, judged by the clothes on your back or the mud on your boots? Let me know down in the comments what happened, because that single moment, that quiet dismissal of a man in dirty overalls, was the tiny little seed from which a mighty oak of consequence was about to grow. It set in motion a chain of events that would echo through our little county for the next 20 years. The walk back to his truck was long enough for the quiet anger to settle into a cold, hard resolve in Art's gut. It wasn't the first time. The world was changing, and men like Henderson and Dale Peterson were the new kings. They saw his old, paid-for equipment not as a sign of prudence, but as a mark of failure. They saw his refusal to take on debt as cowardice, not wisdom. They didn't understand that his John Deere 4020 wasn't just a tractor to him. It was a partner. He knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every whine and groan it made. He knew the precise spot on the throttle where the diesel engine sang its happiest song, that perfect harmony of power and efficiency. He fired up his '65 Chevy C10, the straight-six engine, turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. The cab smelled of old vinyl and hay dust. As he pulled out onto the county highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The Henderson Implement sign, big and bold and green, shrank until it was just a speck. Let them have their new world, he thought. He would stick to his. Back in his machine shed, the smell of his world greeted him like an old friend. It was a symphony of smells, the sharp tang of penetrating oil, the earthy scent of drying mud on the cultivator shovels, the faint, acrid whiff of the arc welder in the corner, and over it all, the heavy, reassuring aroma of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid. The 4020 sat in the center of the concrete floor, its side panel off, its iron guts exposed to the light filtering through the dusty windows. This was Art's sanctuary. Every tool had its place on the pegboard walls, their outlines drawn in black marker, so he'd know if one was missing. Wrenches were arranged by size, from the tiny 1/4-inch to the monstrous 2-inch behemoth he used for the axle bolts. He'd built this shop himself, pole by pole, sheet of tin by sheet of tin, the year after he and Martha got married. It was as much a part of the farm as the barn or the house. He wiped his hands on an already black rag and got to work. The job itself was delicate. He first used a small pick to carefully extract the old, flattened O-ring from its groove in the pump housing. It came out in 3 brittle pieces. He cleaned the groove meticulously, first with a clean rag, then with a blast of compressed air to ensure not a single speck of grit remained. Any contamination could score the new seal, and he'd be right back where he started. He took the new O-ring from his pocket and lightly coated it with fresh hydraulic fluid, his calloused finger rolling it gently to ensure it was lubricated all the way around. This would help it slide into place without tearing. He seated it carefully, making sure it was perfectly settled in its groove, a perfect black circle against the clean, cast iron. Then came the reassembly. He slid the pump's end plate back on, the metal-on-metal hiss a satisfying sound. He started the 4 bolts by hand, turning them until they were finger-tight, ensuring none were cross-threaded. Then he picked up his 1/2-inch drive torque wrench. The manual, its pages soft and stained with the fingerprints of 2 decades of repairs, lay open on his workbench. It called for 55 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern to ensure the plate seated evenly. Click! The wrench signaled the first bolt was a torque. He moved to the opposite bolt. Click! Then the other 2. Click! Click! He went around one more time, just to be sure. Perfect. He reconnected the high-pressure steel line, giving the flare nut a firm, but not excessive turn with a line wrench. Over-tightening could be just as bad as under-tightening. It was a feel, a sense of rightness that came from thousands of hours of this exact kind of work. He topped off the hydraulic reservoir, the new fluid a clean, honey-colored amber. He climbed up into the familiar, worn-in seat, the vinyl cracked in a pattern that fit him perfectly. He turned the key. The starter motor whined for a second, and then the big 6-cylinder diesel roared to life, settling into a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated up through the floorboards and into his bones. It was the sound of health, of power held in reserve. He let it warm up for a few minutes, his eyes fixed on the pressure gauge. It climbed steadily and held, rock solid. He cycled the 3-point hitch up and down, then the remote hydraulics. The movement was smooth, powerful, and silent. He got down and ran a clean hand under the pump housing. Dry. Not a single drop. A slow smile spread across Art's face. It was a satisfaction Dale Peterson, with his warranty and his dealer service calls, would never, ever know. The next morning, the talk at the grain elevator's coffee shop was, as expected, all about Dale. Art sat in his usual corner booth, nursing a black coffee, listening to the chatter. "Did you see that new Steiger Dale's getting?" One farmer, a man named Miller, asked the table. 4-wheel drive. Must have cost him 50 grand. "More than that," another chimed in. "But he's farming 2,000 acres now. He needs the power. Kid's smart, using the bank's money to make more money." "Heard he picked up the lease on the old Henderson quarter section too," Miller added. "That's some of the best black dirt in the county." Art just sipped his coffee. He knew that Henderson quarter. Knew it held water in the spring. Knew it had a persistent thistle problem in the South 40. It would take more than a big tractor to make that ground profitable year in and year out. It would take patience. His neighbour Frank slid into the booth opposite him. Frank was older, a man who, like Art, farmed the same ground his father had. "Morning, Art. Get that pump fixed?" "Morning, Frank." "Yep, all set." "Good thing. Looks like we might get in the fields by the weekend," Frank said, then lowered his voice. "Don't pay them any mind." He nodded toward the other table. "They're all just dazzled by the shiny paint. Debt's a heavy chain to drag behind you." "I know it," Art said quietly. But the scorn was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of his life. At the feed store, at church socials, even from his own brother-in-law. "Art, you've got to expand," his brother-in-law had told him at Sunday dinner just last week. "You can't make a living on 320 acres anymore. The government's telling us to get big or get out." The spring of 1971 was a tough one. A late snow pushed planting back 2 weeks. When it finally melted, it was followed by 3 inches of rain that turned the fields into a sea of mud. Dale, with his big 4-wheel drive tractors and flotation tires, was able to get into his fields a week before anyone else. His corn was knee-high by the 4th of July, while Art's was barely a foot tall. Then came the dry spell in August. The sky turned a hazy, brassy color, and the corn leaves started to curl in on themselves during the heat of the day, a plant's silent scream for water. Art worked tirelessly, his old 2-row cultivator scratching at the dry, cracked soil, trying to preserve what little moisture was left. One sweltering afternoon, the engine on the 4020 started to run rough. It coughed and sputtered. Art knew the sound instantly. Fuel starvation. He shut it down in the middle of the row and climbed off, the heat rising from the engine block in shimmering waves. He bled the fuel lines, checked the filters. They were clogged with a fine, rust-colored sediment. The tank had rust in it. Another problem inherited from the past. He spent the rest of the day draining the tank, flushing it, installing a new set of filters. He lost a whole day of cultivating, a critical day. By the time he was done, his hands were raw, his face was caked in dust and sweat, and his back felt like a hot poker was being pressed against his spine. Martha brought him a mason jar of lemonade out in the field, her face etched with worry. "You push yourself too hard, Art," she said, her hand resting on his shoulder. "It's got to be done, Martha," he said, taking a long drink. "No one else is going to do it for me." Harvest that year was a disappointment. His yields were down 15%. Dale's, with his early planting and his newer hybrid seeds, were the best in the county. At the elevator, when Art got his settlement check, it was just enough to cover his property taxes, his seed and fertilizer bill for the next year, and leave a little left over to put away. It was a living, but it wasn't prosperity. Dale, meanwhile, traded in his year-old Ford pickup for a brand-new Lincoln Continental. He drove it past Art's place one evening, honking the horn, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Art was out by the fence, fixing a broken wire. He didn't even look up. He just kept stretching the wire, his focus absolute, his jaw set like granite. Then, in the summer of 1972, everything changed. News came crackling over the AM radio. Stories whispered in the coffee shop that at first seemed too good to be true. A massive grain deal. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of their own, was buying American wheat, corn, and soybeans on an unprecedented scale. They were buying millions of metric tons, emptying the grain elevators and sending shockwaves through the commodities markets. Overnight, the price of corn doubled. Soybeans went through the roof. The sleepy, predictable world of agriculture was suddenly a high-stakes casino, and every farmer in the county was holding a winning hand. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butts, became a household name, his voice a constant presence on the radio, urging farmers to plant fensero to fensero. It was a new gospel, a gospel of expansion, production, and profit. And Dale Peterson was its most fervent disciple. The boom was a vindication for men like Dale. His massive acreage, which had seemed like a risky gamble just a year before, was now a gold mine. He sold his 72 corn crop for a price that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The checks that came in had so many zeros on them it was hard to count. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a tycoon, a local hero, the man who had seen the future and bet correctly. He immediately leveraged that success. He bought the 240-acre farm that bordered his own, paying a premium price without even blinking. He showed up at Henderson Implement and bought a second 1466 and a brand new 12-row planter to go with it. He wasn't just farming anymore. He was building an empire, one bank loan at a time. The local banker, who had once been cautious, now treated Dale like royalty, offering him lines of credit that were staggering. Land values in the county shot up, doubling and then tripling in the space of 2 years. Everyone was rich, or at least they felt like they were. Art had a good year, too. A very good year. The price he got for his corn and beans was the best of his life. When he sold his last bushel, he came home and sat down at the kitchen table with Martha, the settlement check in his hand. It was more money than he had ever seen in one place. "We could do it, Art," Martha said, her voice soft. "We could buy that 80 acres south of us, the Wilson place. It's for sale. It would give us a bit more cushion." Art looked at the check, then out the window at his own fields, golden with stubble under the autumn sun. He thought about it. He thought about the pride of owning more, of expanding, of finally shutting up the doubters at the coffee shop. He could get a loan, use this check as a down payment. With prices like these, he'd have it paid off in no time. It was the smart thing to do. It was what everyone was doing. But something held him back. A voice, deep inside, that sounded a lot like his father's. "Never bet the seed corn," his father used to say. "Never count on a high price, because the fall is always harder than the climb." He looked back at Martha. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We're going to do something else." The next day, he went to the bank. But he didn't go to the loan officer's desk where Dale Peterson was a regular visitor. He went to the teller window. He took that massive check and he did 3 things. First, he paid off the small, lingering operating note he took out every spring for seed and fertilizer. It wasn't much, but he wanted it gone. His farm, his equipment, and his operation were now 100% his, free and clear. Second, he took a large chunk of the money and bought U.S. savings bonds and long-term certificates of deposit. The interest rates were starting to climb, a fact most farmers ignored, but Art had noticed. The teller, a young woman who was used to seeing farmers applying for loans, looked at him with confusion. Third, with the money that was left, he bought 20 head of black Angus heifers. Good breeding stock. Cattle were a long-term investment, something solid you could see and touch, not just a number on a piece of paper. When word got out what Art had done, the community reaction was a mix of pity and scorn. He had become a local curiosity, the man who was handed a golden ticket and chose to frame it instead of cashing it in. Dale Peterson cornered him at the feed mill a week later. Dale was wearing a new suede jacket and smelled faintly of expensive cologne. "Art, I heard what you did," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Putting your money in the bank? At 5% interest? Hell, land is appreciating at 20% a year. You're losing money by standing still. I made more in the last 6 months than you'll make in the next 10 years. "Maybe so, Dale," Art said, shouldering a bag of calf feed. "But I sleep pretty good at night." "You can't sleep your way to the top," Dale shot back, laughing as he walked away. Art was seen as a failure, a man without vision, a relic who didn't understand the new rules of the game. He kept his head down and went about his work. He fixed his fences, tended to his new herd of cattle, and maintained his machinery with the same meticulous care as always. He and Martha lived simply. They didn't buy a new car or remodel the kitchen. They lived on what they had, their security not in the promise of future prices, but in the black ink of their bank ledger, and the deed to their land, held safe in a box in the study. He felt a quiet peace in his decisions, a deep sense of rightness that no amount of community scorn could shake. But as the 1970s wore on, a storm was gathering on the economic horizon, a storm that few, in their euphoria, could see. On the nightly news, there were whispers of inflation, an oil embargo, and interest rates that were starting to creep up, then jog, then sprint. The music of the boom years was still playing loud, but Art Jenkins was one of the only men in the county who could hear that the fiddler was starting to demand his payment. He'd look out at Dale Peterson's ever-expanding empire of new iron and freshly ploughed earth, an empire built entirely on the shifting sands of credit, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a day of reckoning was coming. The good years rolled on, a golden age of seemingly endless prosperity. The late 70s were a blur of high prices, new pickups in every driveway, and the constant, reassuring roar of big new tractors turning the black earth. Dale Peterson's operation had become a sprawling enterprise. He now farmed close to 3,000 acres, a patchwork of owned and rented ground that stretched across 3 townships. He had a full-time hired man, and, during planting and harvest, a crew of seasonal help. His green and red fleet of machinery was the envy of the county, always the latest model, always gleaming under the sun. He built a new, climate-controlled machine shed that looked more like an aircraft hangar, dwarfing Art's humble pole barn. Art, meanwhile, continued on his quiet, steady path. His herd of Angus cattle grew, their calves providing a reliable, if not spectacular, income every fall. He re-roofed the barn, paid for in cash. He helped Martha put in a bigger garden and bought her a new canning setup. He lived by the cycles of the seasons, not the commodities market. He still drove his '65 Chevy. He still fixed his own equipment. In the eyes of the community, he was a ghost, a man living in the past, while the world marched on without him. The first tremor came not from the markets, but from the sky. The summer of 1980 began with a blistering heat that settled over the heartland like a suffocating blanket. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down from a cloudless metallic sky. The corn, which had sprung from the earth full of promise, began to suffer. Its broad green leaves curled inward, turning a sickly, pale green, then a brittle, silvery grey. The topsoil, that rich black gold, turned to a fine grey powder that blew in the relentless hot wind. Art watched his fields with a familiar ache of worry. He cultivated carefully, trying to break the crust and conserve any deep moisture, his old 40-20 kicking up clouds of dust that followed him like a spectre. He had his cattle, a buffer against a poor crop. They could graze the stunted corn if it came to that. It wouldn't be a good year, but he would survive. He had no big payments to make. For Dale Peterson, the drought was a catastrophe in the making. His entire operation was a high-wire act, balanced on the assumption of bumper crops and high prices. One afternoon, Art was mending a fence along the road that separated his farm from one of Dale's rented sections when he saw it. Dale's massive Steiger, the four-wheel drive beast he'd bought a few years back, was sitting motionless in the middle of a parched field, a 40-foot field cultivator buried in the dust behind it. A white service truck from Henderson Implement was parked beside it. Art watched from a distance as Bill Henderson and a young mechanic in greasy coveralls stood with Dale, shaking their heads. The argument was heated, their gestures sharp and angry, even from a quarter-mile away. The service truck eventually drove off, leaving the big tractor sitting silent and impotent. Later that evening, Frank stopped by. "You see Dale's Steiger?" Frank asked, leaning against Art's pickup. "Saw it sitting out there," Art replied, not looking up from the grease zerk he was cleaning. "Final drive went out," Frank said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Henderson told him it's a special order part from the factory. 6 weeks, maybe more. And the bill to fix it? $10,000. Dale about had a fit right there in the field. $10,000. The words hung in the air. That was more than Art had paid for his 40C20, brand new, back in '68, for a single repair. "He's got 2 other tractors," Art said quietly. "Yeah, but that Steiger's the only one big enough to pull that new cultivator of his. He bought the machine to match the tractor, and now the tractor's down. The whole system's broke. He's losing time, and this year you can't afford to lose a single day." A week later, the second tremor hit. It came crackling over the radio during the noon farm report. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president had announced a full embargo on grain sales to the USSR. The market that had created the boom, the very foundation of the decade's prosperity, was gone. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. The price of corn on the Chicago Board of Trade plummeted, dropping the daily limit for 3 days straight. A farmer's net worth, so solid on paper just a week before, evaporated into thin air. The mood in the coffee shop turned from boastful to funereal. The talk was no longer of new equipment, but of operating loans, of margins, of how to stay afloat. The men who had once clapped Dale Peterson on the back now avoided his gaze. Dale himself looked gaunt, his swagger replaced by a frantic, hunted energy. The drought had crippled his yield, the embargo had destroyed the price, and his $10,000 repair bill was still sitting on his desk. And somewhere, in a quiet office at the bank, a loan officer was looking at the Peterson file with a fresh and much more critical eye. The cracks in the empire were beginning to show, spreading like fissures in the dry, cracked earth of his fields. The fall of 1980 was a grim harvest. The corn stalks were short and brittle, the ears small and poorly filled. Art's yields were down by 1/3, but he brought in what he could, his old John Deere 4400 combine chugging along reliably. He stored most of his grain, hoping for a price recovery that he suspected would be a long time coming. His cattle were thin, but healthy. He would make it through the winter. For Dale, the harvest was a nightmare. His big new 7700 combine, designed for high yields, was inefficient with the poor crop, leaving kernels scattered on the ground. He had to run it slow, burning expensive diesel for every meager bushel. When his settlement checks came from the elevator, they were a fraction of what he had projected, a fraction of what he needed. The numbers didn't add up. The cost of his seed, his fertilizer, his fuel, his repairs, his land payments, his equipment loans. It was a mountain of debt, and his income was a molehill. But the true death blow came not from the fields or the markets, but from the Federal Reserve. To combat rampant nationwide inflation, the chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, began to aggressively raise interest rates. It was a necessary, bitter medicine for the country's economy, but for the farmers who had been encouraged to borrow heavily, it was a poison. The prime lending rate, which had been a manageable 7 or 8% when Dale signed his notes, began a terrifying climb. 10%, 12, 15. It kept rising, a relentless, unholy tide of red ink. By 1981, it was cresting over 20%. Dale's loans were almost all variable rate. It had been the smart move in the 70s, locking in lower payments. Now it was a guillotine. The interest on his debt was compounding faster than he could even comprehend. His payments ballooned, doubling and then tripling. The banker who had once taken him out for steak dinners now refused to take his calls. The friendly letters from Henderson Implement were replaced by certified mail, demanding payment in stark, legal terms. The dream was over. The empire was collapsing. The first auction notice appeared in the county paper in the spring of '82. It wasn't Dale's, but it was a neighbor of his, a young man who had tried to follow the Peterson playbook. The community gathered on a cold, windy Saturday, not with the excitement of a bargain hunt, but with the somber silence of a wake. They watched as a man's life work was sold off, piece by piece, for pennies on the dollar. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant sounded like a eulogy. Art was there. He didn't bid. He just watched, his heart heavy. Dale's day came that autumn. The notice was a full page in the paper, a testament to the sheer scale of his holdings. Everything was listed: the land, the equipment, the tools, even the Lincoln Continental. The bank was liquidating the entire operation. The day of the auction was grey and overcast, threatening a cold rain. The crowd was the biggest the county had ever seen. Farmers came from all over the state, drawn by the prospect of acquiring nearly new, high-horsepower equipment at foreclosure prices. Corporate farm buyers, men in clean boots and company jackets, moved through the crowd with clipboards, their faces impassive. Art arrived early in his old Chevy, parking it way down the road. He walked up the long driveway, the same one Dale had so proudly driven his new cars down. The machinery was lined up in neat rows in the yard, washed and polished for the sale. The Steiger, the two 1466, the massive 7700 combine with its corn and bean heads. It was a stunning display of capital, a monument to a fallen king. He saw Dale standing near the house, a hollowed-out version of his former self. His expensive jacket was gone, replaced by a simple work coat. His face was pale, his eyes vacant. He was talking to his wife, who was weeping quietly into a handkerchief. Bill Henderson was there too, overseeing the sale of the equipment his dealership was repossessing. He looked stressed, his professional smile gone, replaced by the grim look of a man trying to recover a bad debt. Art walked through the lines of equipment. He ran a hand over the giant tire of the Steiger. He looked at the complex tangle of hydraulics and wiring on the combine. They were magnificent machines, powerful and complex, and they had broken a man. He moved on, past the big stuff, to the smaller implements, the tools, the contents of the shop. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here because this was a moment in the life of his community, and he felt he had to bear witness to it. Then he saw it. Tucked away behind a grain wagon, almost as an afterthought, was an older tractor. It was a John Deere 4020, just like his, but a few years newer. It was dusty, and one of the rear fenders was dented, but he could tell it was mechanically sound. It had probably been Dale's father's tractor, the one Dale had traded in his ambition for. The auction started. The big-ticket items went first. The corporate buyers and large operators from out of state got into bidding wars. The Steiger, which Dale had paid over $60,000 for, sold for $25,000. The combine, with a sticker price near $100,000, went for $32,000. Art watched as Dale's entire net worth was dismantled in a matter of hours, the auctioneer's hammer falling like a judge's gavel. The local farmers, most of them struggling themselves, could only watch, their faces grim. They couldn't compete. Then they came to the old 4020, The auctioneer started the bidding at 5,000. There was silence. The big operators weren't interested. It was too small, too old. The local farmers were tapped out. "Do I hear 5,000? The auctioneer called out, his voice sounding impatient. "Come on, folks, it's a classic deer. Runs good. 4,000. Do I hear 4? More silence. The auctioneer was about to move on. From the back of the crowd, a quiet, clear voice said, 4,000. Every head turned. It was Art Jenkins. He stood there in his clean but worn overalls, his old cap in his hand. Bill Henderson stared, his mouth slightly agape. Dale Peterson looked up, his eyes showing the first flicker of life Art had seen in them all day. "I have 4,000 from Mr. Jenkins," the auctioneer boomed, surprised. "Do I hear 4,500? Silence. "Sold," the hammer fell, "for $4,000 to Arthur Jenkins." Art walked to the clerk's trailer, wrote out a check from his savings account, and got the title. He didn't stop there. As the auction moved to the tools and miscellaneous items, Art kept bidding. He bought a heavy-duty drill press, a nearly new air compressor, a set of large combination wrenches Dale had probably never even used. He paid cash for it all. He was walking back to his truck when Dale approached him. He stopped, unsure what the man would say. "Art?" Dale said, his voice raspy. He couldn't quite meet Art's eyes. "That was my dad's tractor." "I know," Art said simply. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to fix that fender, give it a tune-up, and put it to work," Art said. He paused, then added, "Look, Dale, if you need some hours, I could use a hand this spring. It won't pay much, but it's honest work." Dale stared at him, his face a mixture of shock, shame, and a profound, heart-breaking gratitude. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. Art nodded back and walked away. He hadn't come here for revenge. He had come and found a way to offer a piece of dignity back to a man who had lost everything. The next day, the real work began. Art had been watching the markets, not just for grain, but for steel. He knew that the Henderson Implement dealership was in trouble. They had extended millions in credit to farmers like Dale, and now those notes were worthless. They had a yard full of repossessed equipment they couldn't sell because no one had the money or the credit to buy it. Art drove his Chevy into town and walked into the dealership. The gleaming showroom was empty, a tomb of green and yellow. Bill Henderson was in his office, his head in his hands. He looked up as Art entered, his face haggard. "Art," he said, his voice weary. "If you're here to say, 'I told you so,' just get it over with." "Not here for that, Bill," Art said, his voice even. "I'm here to make you an offer." Art sat down and laid out his plan. He opened a worn leather satchel and took out a sheaf of papers. They were the certificates of deposit and the savings bonds he had bought back in 1972. Matured with a decade of compounded interest, they represented a significant sum of cash, cold, hard, liquid cash, the rarest of commodities in the Farm Belt of 1982. "Your yard is full," Art said. "You're paying interest on that inventory. The bank is breathing down your neck. You need to move it. I'll buy it. All of it." Henderson stared. "All of it? Art, that's nearly $1 million worth of machinery." "It was," Art corrected him gently. "It's not worth that now. It's worth what someone will pay you for it, today, in cash. I'll give you $200,000 for the Steiger, the 214-66, the 7700 combine and both heads, and that big 12-row planter. Cash, today. You clear your books, you satisfy your lender, and you get to stay in business." Henderson was speechless. The offer was insultingly low compared to the original prices. But it was also a lifeline. It was more cash than he had seen in a year. He knew Art was right. The equipment was a dead weight, an anchor pulling him under. $200,000 in cash was better than $1 million in maybes. He looked at Art, really looked at him for the first time. He saw not an old-fashioned fool, but a man of incredible foresight and discipline. "Okay, Art," Henderson said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You've got a deal." That afternoon, Art Jenkins, the man who had been mocked for his 50-cent O-ring, wrote a check and became the owner of one of the most powerful fleets of farm machinery in the state. He hired a trucking company to haul it all back to his farm. As the lowboy trailers rolled down his driveway, unloading the massive gleaming machines next to his modest shed, his neighbors watched in stunned silence. The news spread through the county like wildfire. Art Jenkins had weathered the storm, and while everyone else was drowning, he had emerged with the spoils of a collapsed kingdom, all bought and paid for. He now owned nearly $900,000 worth of modern iron, and he didn't owe a single dime on any of it. Life settled into a new rhythm. The 1980s were lean years, but for Art they were manageable. He had the land, he had the equipment, and he had no debt. He slowly and carefully began to expand his operation. When a neighboring farm came up for sale, lost to the bank, Art bought it, paying cash from his cattle operation and the profits from his now larger grain harvests. He didn't build a new hangar-sized shed. He simply added a long, sturdy lean-to onto his existing one. Dale Peterson came to work for him that spring, just as Art had offered. It was a humbling experience for Dale, driving the same tractors that had once been his, on land he had once farmed. But Art treated him with respect, as an employee and a neighbor, never once mentioning the past. In time, Dale saved up enough to rent a small farm of his own, starting over, this time with the hard-won wisdom of failure. The two men would sometimes meet on the road, and they would raise a hand to each other, a quiet acknowledgement of the great, turning wheel of fortune they had both ridden. Art became a quiet legend in the county. The younger farmers, the ones who had survived the crash or were just starting out, began to stop by his shop. They didn't come to talk about market projections. They came to ask how to rebuild a carburetor or how to weld a cracked frame. Art would always stop what he was doing, wipe his hands on a rag, and show them. He would explain the mechanics of it, but he would also weave in the lessons his father had taught him. "Never buy a machine you can't fix," he'd say, "and never bet the farm on a price you can't control." Years later, in the early 90s, Art was an old man, his hair white, his movements slower, but his hands still sure. He was in the shop with his grandson, a boy of 16 with an aptitude for mechanics. They weren't working on the old 4020, which now sat in a place of honor, restored and gleaming, used only for light chores and parades. They were working on the big Steiger, changing the hydraulic fluid. "Grandpa," the boy asked, tightening a drain plug, "is it true, what they say in town, that you bought all this for cash when everyone else was going broke?" Art smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He walked over to his old workbench and picked up a small, cracked O-ring he kept in a little tin box. "It's true," he said, handing the brittle piece of rubber to the boy. "But it didn't start with a big check. It started with this. It started with knowing the value of 75 cents and the satisfaction of a job you do with your own two hands." He looked out the big shop door, across his fields, now green with the promise of a new spring. He saw the land he owned, the machines he understood, the family he had provided for, and the legacy he would leave behind. It wasn't an empire built on credit and pride, but a foundation laid with patience, wisdom, and the quiet dignity of a man in dirty overalls who knew the difference between what the world thought was valuable and what truly was.